Hello and welcome to my channel. Before starting, support the channel by liking this video and subscribing to this channel for future updates. Today I'm going to talk about understanding the BRICS nations and their economic influence. Over the past 2 decades, there has been an astonishing restructuring of global economic power. This has been driven primarily by the rise of China and, to a lesser extent, the BRICS countries more broadly, which, in addition to the East Asian giant, encompass Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa. As this group has become increasingly formalized and institutionalized, hosting regular summits and establishing collective bodies, many observers have worried that its growing influence might be accompanied by the normalization of authoritarian forms of state capitalism, and even the unraveling of the liberal order. Others have taken a more sanguine view, arguing that Eastern forms of state-led development appear superior in many ways to Anglo-American economic and political structures, and this is reconcilable with, and indeed depends on, an open global economy. Either way, the concerns of many Western liberals have resurfaced following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Recent news that other mostly non-democratic states, Egypt, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Argentina, have either applied to join the BRICS or are considering doing so. It's also cause for concern among Western governments. What are the BRICS and why do they matter? At one level, the idea of the BRICS is confected. The former Goldman Sachs economist and now crossbench peer, Jim O'Neill, coined the term BRIC in the early 2000s to describe the 4 fast-growing countries that, at the turn of the millennium, seemed most likely to begin catching up with the West. Looking back, this notion appears quite problematic. Brazil's growth slowed dramatically around 2014 as it struggled with early deindustrialization. Russia was an erstwhile superpower. To describe it as rising, therefore, was and remains questionable, particularly as its industrially atrophied post-communist economy has stayed small in global terms. Even today, as the country mounts a major military offensive, its GDP is still barely half that of the UK, despite a population almost 3 times the size and the largest, most resource-rich territory on the planet. India's growth has been impressive, but its relative share of global GDP has actually shrunk, and its economy is now around 1/5 the size of China's. One author describes the pair comparatively as the slouching tiger and roaring dragon. South Africa is arguably not a rising power at all in global terms, and was primarily tagged onto the grouping later for reasons of regional representativeness. In fact, the story of the BRICS is largely about China's staggering rise. Its development has been so sustained over such a long period of time that it has genuinely reshaped the distribution of global economic power. As the chart shows, China's GDP is more than double that of the other 4 BRICS combined, almost $18 trillion compared with Brazil, $1.6 trillion, Russia, $1.8 trillion, India, $3.2 trillion, and South Africa, $400 billion. For comparative purposes, GDP in the United States is $23 trillion, but China's economy is arguably the largest in the world in purchasing power parity, PPP terms. In the early research on the subject, there were fierce debates over which countries should and should not be included in the next generation of emerging powers. Some questioned whether the MIN countries, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey, might be next. Others stressed that a focus on large middle-income countries ignores the many small ones, such as New Zealand, Norway, Qatar, and Singapore, that have achieved high levels of income and development while exercising power in unconventional ways. There have always been question marks over which countries exactly should comprise the rising or emerging powers and what criteria best capture this. What does it even mean to rise or emerge? And how do we know when a state has finally risen or emerged? By the same token, as some rise, others must decline relatively. Do we even have a language to describe developmental decline or a development in supposedly developed countries? These questions aside, the BRICS have, over time, become more deeply institutionalized. Since 2009, the countries have held annual summits with an increasingly widened agenda. The establishment of the New Development Bank, NDB, in 2014 with $50 billion of startup capital was another milestone. So too was the simultaneous creation of the BRICS Contingent Reserve Arrangement, CRA, a liquidity mechanism that provides support for members facing short-term balance of payments squeezes or currency instability. It is in this context, at a time when much of the world is still reeling from the pandemic, that this institutionalization process may be intensifying. Why are countries seeking new forms of cooperation? The motivations of prospective BRICS members are complex. Take Saudi Arabia. It is already an exceptionally wealthy country. It has a close security relationship with the United States, and it can mobilize substantial sovereign wealth for investment in pursuit of economic expansion. But domestic political modernization remains slow, and the economy is highly dependent on energy and threatened in the long run by global decarbonization. A degree of diplomatic isolation has also followed the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. Like all authoritarian states, Saudi Arabia has to search for sources of domestic and international legitimacy. Increasingly dense trade links with China will be critical to this endeavor by simultaneously diversifying the economy and sources of international support. Similar stories apply to Egypt, Iran, and Turkey, where the respective regimes have all experienced volatile economies, political conflict, and diplomatic isolation in recent history. The Arab Spring of a decade ago still cast a very long shadow over the Middle East as a whole, leaving rulers feeling insecure and repression enduring. Another potential BRICS member, Argentina, is a little different. Growth has fluctuated constantly since the dramatic financial crisis of 2001. Periods of expansion and policy experimentation have occurred in tandem with buoyant export revenues during the late 2000s and early 2010s. But inflation has remained high and the currency has tanked. $1 bought 1 peso prior to 2001. A decade later, it bought 8 to 10 pesos, and yet a decade further on, it now buys 148. Debt is also growing again. It exploded from around 40% of GDP to 160% in the aftermath of the 2001 crisis, declined again to around 40% alongside the commodity boom by 2014, and then rose once more to over 100% of GDP by the time the pandemic arrived in 2020. Argentina has long required new sources of capital and international institutional power. Indeed, its demand for inclusion in the Group of 20 G20 during the global financial crisis of 2007-9 in part reflected resentment at Brazil's membership and relatively higher perceived status as an emerging power. But what is in it for the BRICS as an organization? New members, in theory, apply new economic resources that can be mobilized in greater strength in numbers. The expansion of the group also provides greater legitimacy and reinforces the sense that the club is worth joining, an effect that could become self-perpetuating. At the same time, while these potential new members are certainly regionally significant, they are not the largest, most powerful, economically dynamic, or diplomatically influential of countries that could theoretically join, certainly compared with the Mint countries. Furthermore, the BRICS would no longer really comprise mainly the rising powers in global sense, with Argentina, Iran, and Saudi Arabia joining. Consequently, the broader issue is that the BRICS as an organization still lacks deeper institutionalization. Beyond the establishment of the NDB, it is difficult to see what the group has done other than meet annually. This problem is compounded by the fact that economic growth trajectories have been so uneven, and the group lacks clear unifying ideological principles or a shared vision for managing the global order. Thanks for watching.